All right, now we just, as you saw, laid out the case there that Republicans are doubling down on their racism as the midterms draw near, and more alt-right figures are embracing white supremacism. So the question now is, what should the Democrats be doing about it? Steve Phillips, the founder and chairman of Power Pack Plus, is out with a new book entitled How to Win the Civil War: Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. Phillips takes Democrats to task, arguing, quote, Democrats remain reluctant to define and engage the actual fight we're facing, a fight characterized by the battle for justice, equality, and inclusion of people of color and their allies on the one hand, and by a virulent, fear-based white backlash on the other. Steve Phillips joins me now. Steve, it's great to have you. Fascinated by this conversation that we're about to have, but you write about how Democrats aren't taking this seriously enough and how they allowed Republicans to basically steamroll them in Virginia last year with their fears of critical race theory and the panic they were able to gin up. What other wake-up calls do the Democrats need at this point to get their act together?
Well, it's a good question in that it's been such a long-standing, tried-and-true element of the right wing and of the conservatives and the ideological heirs of the Confederacy who have really never stopped fighting the battle to have this be a country for straight white Christian men. And so, really, in my book I talk about MAGA being "Make America White Again." So it's so long-standing, right? I mean, you talked about the Central America caravan issues back in 2018. On this exact date, 4 years ago during the last midterms, Trump was tweeting about this Central America caravan, and that was on a Monday. On the Friday of that week, the Robert Bowers, a white man in Pittsburgh, took his gun to Tree of Life Synagogue because he was alarmed by what Trump was saying, and shot and killed many Jews in that synagogue, one of the worst massacres on our soil. And so it's a long-standing tradition. Nixon engaged in this back in '68 after Martin Luther King was killed, running on a platform of law and order. So by now, Democrats should be able to understand it and get it. And what they don't understand is the country has changed. This is really all about trying to inflame and scare and galvanize white people. But the country in the 60s was only 12% people of color. Now it's 40%. And so now they need to call these things out for what they are, summon whites to take a stand against this type of white fear-mongering, and challenge people to rise to their highest and best selves to be able to fight to make this a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, and people, in my opinion, falsely believe, they say, oh, America has a long tradition of being a democracy. And I push back on that sometimes because I think America has not been a true democracy since everyone was allowed to vote. And that wasn't until the 60s when women were allowed to vote, obviously before that, but then black and brown people were allowed to vote. So we have not been a multi-ethnic, multiracial society and a democracy for that long when you think about it. Are you at all surprised, the polls citing 54% of strong Republicans believe a civil war is likely in the next decade, because it kind of undercuts this notion that we're a long country with a long tradition of stability?
Well, you're quite correct. We did not have democracy in this country until 1965, when LBJ and the Congress, after the Civil Rights Movement, Jimmy Lee Jackson and Reverend Reeb gave their lives to fight to actually get the Voting Rights Act passed. Until then, it was perfectly legal to exclude people of color from voting within this country, essentially. So how is that a democracy? So we've only been a democracy since '65, and people have been trying to undermine the Voting Rights Act ever since. And so you have this regard. But fundamentally is that we don't appreciate how close we came to having actual fascism in this country. You can look up the definition about where a dictator refuses to leave power on January 6th of 2021.
Yeah.
And so we were on the precipice of this. And so this notion that we are far away from this, we have all these democratic traditions, was teetering in the balance. The majority of Republicans on January 6th voted to throw out the election of this country. So we are not far away from it at all. What I fundamentally try to highlight for people to get the urgency of the situation is that the Confederates and their heirs have never stopped fighting. You had this segment earlier about defending the Confederate monuments. The Confederates were white nationalist mass murderers who wanted to buy and sell people of color. Why do we have monuments to them in this country? Why are there monuments to them in the United States Capitol? So this fundamental battle over whether this is primarily a white country, make America white again, or is it a multiracial democracy, rages to this day. Reverend Warnock had talked about how are we going to be a January 5th country where the successor to Martin Luther King is elected to the Senate, or are we going to be a January 6th country? And that remains the battle that we're engaged in this country.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely brilliant the way you frame it like that. I wanted to get your reaction to this. You had the New York Attorney General Letitia James and Governor Kathy Hochul releasing this report just this week, saying that fringe online platforms played a role in radicalizing the Buffalo shooter who shot up a supermarket earlier this year in that hate crime. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, so the whole first half of my book, I talk about how the Confederates never stopped fighting, starting with assassinating Lincoln 5 days after supposedly surrendering, and all the way up through January 6th. And I talk about how there's a consistent Confederate battle plan with multiple dimensions to it. And one of the elements of it, in addition to distorting public opinion and never giving an inch, is silently sanctioning terrorism. And at every level, they've been silently sanctioning terrorism, sometimes not so silently as when Donald Trump told the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by in a national presidential debate. And as I was saying at the top, 4 years ago on this date, Trump began fanning the flames that led to the white domestic terrorism that took place at Tree of Life Synagogue. And so it's a long-standing core part of their battle plan is to inflame those who are on the fringes and prone to violence. And it really is a challenge to who is everybody else going to stand up for that and call it out. Because when it's called out, that's when you actually have the greatest impact around stamping it out.
And yet even trying to call it out is hard when you have the GOP not letting up with their racist dog whistles in their attack ads. I mean, the Bulwark reported recently that you had Wisconsin State Republican Party sending out mailers that darken the skin color of Mandela Barnes, who is a black man running against Ron Johnson, a white man. And it's just another result of racism that is now being emboldened and embraced by the Republican Party.
Right. I mean, they're unrelenting, right? So when Antonio Delgado ran in New York in 2018, they were calling him a Los Angeles rapper, right? And trying to invoke all of these different stereotypes. And as you had mentioned, the Virginia piece, this is what the Democrats need to understand, is that the composition of the country has changed. These are all long-standing attempts to inflame the passions of white people to be able to support the Republicans. But the white population is not as numerically dominant as it's historically been. This is a far more multiracial country now, and there's a meaningful minority of whites who will stand up against it. And that's what they failed to do in Virginia, is to respond to the CRT attacks by saying that, no, you're just trying to whitewash history and glorify white nationalism. Instead, there was a very technical answer in trying to change the subject. They're clearly leaning into these race-based attacks, and the best way to refute them, and there's a lot of research around that, on this. You know, Tali Mendelberg, who's a professor at Princeton, has studied this. She studied the Willie Horton attacks that you mentioned, and shows that the best way to beat it back is to call it out, make it explicit. And when you don't do that, that's when these attacks are more powerful.
Steve Phillips, fascinating conversation, excellent work. The book is called How to Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. God knows this country needs it now more than ever. Thank you so much for your time. Up next, new